Well, thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here. And what I'd love to share with you, just to set the stage, is not only some data work that we've done to highlight the geography of economic mobility in this country, but also to talk about a few ways in which we're starting to use those data to set the stage for the mayor, who'll tell you much more about what he and his staff are doing for upward mobility in children in the United States. So just to start and set the stage at the broadest level, I want to provide some data behind a fact that President Paxson noted, which is that upward mobility is getting harder and harder in the United States, and really all across the world. So what this graph shows is just a very simple statistic, the fraction of children who grow up to have a higher standard of living than their parents did. And it shows that calculated separately for kids born in each year, starting in 1940, all the way over on the left here, where that dot up above 90 says that more than 90% of kids born in 1940 achieved a higher standard of living than their parents did. And it was so successful, nearly so guaranteed, that this was something children could expect, that people talked about the American dream not even as having a higher standard of living than one's parents, but perhaps even doubling the standard of living of one's parents. What we've seen over the last generations, though, is that as we move over to the right side on the graph, that number falls. So that by the time I was born in 1980, it was literally no better than a coin flip whether children would have a higher standard of living than their parents did. And I think I agree with what President Paxson noted, which is this is not only an economic problem, this is a social problem. People are frustrated today, even though the economy is objectively quite strong, unemployment rates are very low, what they feel is that they can't get ahead, they feel like they are not able to experience the type of success in life that they had come to expect. And I think this really lies behind it. Now, what are we going to do about this? So at Opportunity Insights, which is a new research center jointly between Brown and Harvard that I formed with my co-authors, we use big data to study this phenomenon, try to understand what's going on, and eventually what type of policies can we help recommend and develop that will reverse that trend and lead to a return in social mobility across America. And to do so, we're going to analyze really a wide range of interventions all throughout childhood. And the starting point is going to be what we're going to see to be really sharp local differences in upward mobility. Now, why is that something that we feel is useful? Well, I think before showing you the data, it's helpful to lay out a framework for how one might think about using data at the highest level in order to improve upward mobility. And we've really drawn inspiration from the way that they've used big data in another field in medicine, where in a precision medicine approach, one first tries to really understand the problem, the medical problem that one's facing, and then goes about solving that problem. So how does that work in a kind of a social economic context? Well, I think there are three key stages. The first stage is an assessment. We need to actually figure out what's going wrong. And as I'll show you, what turns out to be going wrong in different places is going to be very different. And so what we're going to need to know is actually what do the data say about Providence, and that may be very different from what it says about Boston or Hartford. Second, I think then there's a role for policy pilots where we try to understand what types of policies can succeed. That, of course, need to move beyond the data and work with local stakeholders, and that's why I think it's been so exciting to have a conversation with the mayor later this afternoon. And then there's a step where we need to understand whether what we tried worked, to try to disseminate what worked, to try to reform what didn't work, because things aren't going to work all the time. And that's eventually, you repeat this cycle over and over, you try to end up with scalable policies to increase mobility for those children living in the city. Now, to start with the assessment phase, I'm going to show you some data, and just so we're all on the same page about what it is that I'm showing you, these are data from a tool called the Opportunity Atlas, and we're going to measure upward mobility across America using anonymized data from census and tax records for more than 20 million children linked to their parents. Now, what's very important here is that we're going to look at kids based not on where they're living today, but where they grew up. And it's going to turn out that where you grew up has really important consequences for social mobility in ways I don't think we understood. And so I'm going to show you lots of different colors on maps, and all the time, for instance, if I say some statistic about Providence or some statistic about this neighborhood. It's all about kids who grew up in Providence or grew up in that neighborhood. And as a result, what we're going to be able to do is trace the roots of poverty and incarceration and other long-term outcomes that we care about improving through social mobility. We're going to trace them back to childhood neighborhoods, and that's going to turn out to have a great deal of power. So just to get started, here is a map of the United States. And each color, each of the little polygons, is a city at the moment. The colors are a heat map, so we're mapping from blue, which is very high upper mobility, to red, which is relatively low upper mobility. And just to give you a sense of the scale, you can see a couple of the averages for different cities on the map. For instance, in Charlotte in the southeast, that's a very red area. Children born to parents earning about $25,000 a year, that's at about the 25th percentile of all parents in this generation. Kids born to those families, when they grow up, and we see them at age 35, are on average earning only $26,000. So even for children coming from this very poor set of families, they're really barely making more than their parents did. In contrast, if you look at the upper Midwest, so for instance, if you look at Dubuque, Iowa, children born into the same poor families earning that same $25,000, those children earn nearly double what their parents did when we see them at age 35. They're earning more like $46,000. And so from blue to red, you see the great variation in this country. Providence up in the northeast, we're kind of right about in the middle. Kids born to families earning about $25,000 in Providence grow up when they're 35 years old to be earning about $33,000. Now, I think this map is very useful in pointing out these relatively large regional disparities, but I think there's a limit here because, and I'll tell you about a conversation I had with the mayor at one point. We were looking at this map, and we said, well, gee, Providence is 33,000, that's great, can we make it better? Dubuque, Iowa is so much higher. And I said, well, gee, why don't you just go try to be a little bit more like Dubuque? And he kind of looked at me with a tilt to his head and said, it was very clear that just was not a helpful, practical solution because, Dubuque differs from Providence in so many ways. So it'd just be very difficult to understand what was it about, this kind of city in relatively rural Iowa, very different demographics, very different economy, very different problems that these kids face. Kind of how did those policy solutions map to what we see in Providence? And so instead, what we can do is really dive into the Opportunity Atlas. So this is now a live shot from the website. You can go online at any time you want, opportunityatlas.org. So it's the same colors on the same map. And what we can do is we can zoom into Providence. Nope, that is not Providence. This is Providence. We can zoom into Providence, and the key thing to know here is that I've kept the colors the same. So where you see on the map that's a darker red, those are the same outcomes that we saw down in the southeast part of the United States in places like Charlotte. And the blue and green, those are much higher outcomes, similar to what we saw in Dubuque. But what's striking is that we're seeing that full range of colors all here within just a couple miles of where we're sitting. And even within the boundaries of the city of Providence, you see that same variation. Now, this is plotting all kids, and of course we know that the demographics of kids that live in different places are a little bit different. And so, for instance, on the atlas, you can focus in on different racial or gender subgroups. So, for instance, if you're interested in looking only at Hispanic children, the map looks relatively similar, but you see the same amount of the kind of quite patchwork. There are some very good places and some not so good places. Note that there are some places on the map that are gray. Those are places where there are simply not enough Hispanic children living as a result of residential racial segregation. Same thing, we can look at black children growing up in Providence. Here you see the colors are much more tilted towards blue, and that's a fact about Providence, that it is a relatively good place for black children to grow up. Unfortunately, other work that my co-authors put out has shown that there are quite large racial differences in outcomes, even for children growing up in the same income family on the same block. You see that black children, and especially black men, have considerably worse outcomes in adulthood. And so here, Providence is a very good place for black children relative to other cities in the country, but their outcomes are still, unfortunately, quite a bit lower than for white children. So now going back to everyone, what's important to note here is that this type of variation in part can be explained by things like where it's a really expensive place to live. But it also, there's a lot of variation that goes beyond that. And so what I can do here is flip over to a different version of this map where you see there are now a bunch of gray areas. Those gray areas that I've removed from the map are places where the median family rent for a two-bedroom apartment is more than $1,100. So these are places largely that will be unaffordable by a payment standard for something like a housing voucher. And you see that knocks out a bunch of the east side, it knocks out kind of a nice part of the waterfront that's recently being developed, it knocks out some other areas in the city. But you still see a lot of the variation remains, and for instance, this kind of the Elmhurst neighborhood up by Providence College and Rhode Island College, that's still a very good opportunity place to be, yet it's a place that's very affordable. And it's this type of variation that's going to start to give us a handle on how we can think about using these data to inform policy. So let me now go back and talk about how two ways that we might use these data. And I think those two ways fall broadly into two categories. First, we can think about moving to opportunity, that is taking advantage of housing vouchers and other housing choice programs to help families locate in more high opportunity areas. And then second, we can think about place-based investments, which help directly increase upward mobility in those low opportunity areas. So let me talk about each in turn. In order for families to make sense that they might move to opportunity, it's going to be very important that those high opportunity neighborhoods we see really reflect something about the neighborhood itself, so that one moving to that neighborhood would actually experience the benefits. An alternative possibility is that, even though the families look very similar, say on education or race or income, certain types of families, for instance, that care a lot about education, might choose to live and maybe work at higher education institutions, and so you might see more of those families living up in certain neighborhoods like Elmhurst. And so to investigate that, what we're going to do is actually look at children who move from one neighborhood to another throughout their childhood to get a sense of whether moving from one neighborhood to another seems to affect their trajectories. And to do so, we're going to use the data in a much broader way, but I want you to think about, just as a conceptual example in your head, I want you to think about a family where a child is born on the upper south side. Those are some of the redder areas towards the south side of Providence. And you want you to think about them moving from there to those bluer neighborhoods in the northwest, to Elmhurst, at some point during their childhood. And we're going to compare that child's outcomes to what we might get in two different scenarios. One, the dashed line on the bottom here, is what would have happened for kids who we just observed living in the upper south side for their entire childhood. And the other benchmark is the higher dashed line. That's what we observe for families that have their kids born in Elmhurst and then stay there for their entire lives. So let's now think about these kids who move, and we'll start just with a single example of a child who moves from the upper south side to Elmhurst at age 2. For this child, they're going to earn about $38,000, and the key thing is that it's not quite as high as the kids who were born in Elmhurst and stayed there their entire childhood, but it's almost there. So if you were born on the south side and you move to Elmhurst, you get almost all of the difference in your own outcomes. Now let's just think about moving forward year to year at a time, and think about what happens as a kid moves at age 3, age 4, age 5, and so on. And what I think you'll find to be quite intuitive is that the longer you stay in the upper south side before moving to Elmhurst, the more your outcomes start to converge down to the outcomes of the kids who spend their entire life on the upper south side. So what that's saying is that the longer you spend on the upper south side, the more you look like the upper south side, and the more time you spend growing up in Elmhurst, the more your outcomes are going to look like the outcomes of Elmhurst. And in fact, it's not just that kind of this happens qualitatively, it's almost a lot, right? Every extra year that you're moving to Elmhurst, every extra year you get to spend growing up there is another kind of 20th of the way from the lower dashed line upper south side up to Elmhurst. And so what that really suggests is that it's not just the type of families who live in different places, but really the exposure to these different neighborhoods almost in a kind of linear annual way that seems to matter. And we can even check to make sure that, once this line is converged down to the bottom here, we want to make sure if the family moves out of the Upper South Side after the kid is kind of moved out of the household, one hopes, and it's not really childhood anymore, does it matter? And in fact, there it seems to flatten out. We like to think about this as a placebo test. This is kind of a difference that shouldn't matter, and in fact, it doesn't matter. So what we've learned here is that it seems like moving to these better neighborhoods does in fact seem to have the type of impact on children's trajectories that we might hope. And so now we can think about, is this kind of a type of feasible policy? And again, focusing back on this map where the gray areas that I've removed are the places that are too expensive, all of these areas remain as places where housing vouchers or relatively cheap public housing could be located. Unfortunately, what we see in Providence, and this is not special to Providence, this is something we see in every city across the country in some sense, is that the green and pink dots are where different types of public housing projects are located. So the green are the low-income housing tax credit properties, the pink are the PHA family developments. What you see is they're clustered in the relatively red and orange areas. And if you looked at where housing voucher recipients live, I've done this for many cities, I haven't done this for Providence, I'm guessing you would find a very similar map. So that is people who we try to help support their living and try to give them a little bit of a choice as to where they live. Unfortunately, policy has clustered those families in outcomes, in neighborhoods that are relatively low opportunity. And so I think this is one way that we can think about changing policy to help those families live in higher opportunity areas. There's a pilot project that we're just finishing up in Seattle, which has done exactly this. It's provided a little bit of information to tenants. It's helped recruit landlords in higher opportunity areas and offered a little bit of a housing search assistance to try to help families live in higher opportunity areas. And it's a little bit too early to publicly announce the results of this, but I will say it seems to have been very successful. Now, the second way that I think we can use these data to help improve upward mobility is to actually have place-based investments to increase upward mobility in any given location. Right? In some sense, there's only a limit to the number of families you're going to be able to move from one neighborhood to another, and so this second approach is just going to be a critical piece of any broad-based strategy to increase upward mobility. And here, I think it's very useful to think about the places, kind of how do those high opportunity places differ from low opportunity places, and what can we learn from that about what seem to be the right types of investments to make? Well, first of all, we find that places with lower poverty rates seem to have higher opportunity. It's not about the local availability of jobs, though. It's about the people. It's about having employed adults living in your community. That's what really seems to correlate. If you look at the number of jobs that are nearby, that doesn't seem to correlate with opportunity at all. Second, we find that places with more stable family structures have higher opportunity. I think that makes sense. Third, we find that places with greater social capital promote greater opportunity. And so especially I think these second and third combined with the first, it's all about the fabric of the community. Who are the adults in a community that can mentor, provide role models for children growing up to give them a sense of what paths to a successful life are. And then fourth, better school quality. Places, children spend a lot of their time outside of the family in schools, and so it's not surprising that schools are a very important piece. So thinking about these factors, I think what's also important to come back to that graph I showed you before is that it's not about special moments in kids' lives. So if only we can fix things by age 5, then we'll be all set. If only we can fix college access and get high schoolers on the right path, then we'd be set. What you saw is that every year that goes by is another opportunity where either children are getting nudged towards a better trajectory or not. And so I think what that leads towards is, rather than thinking about kind of discrete interventions at discrete points in time, you want to think about more of a life course approach that's driven by these data. And so at different points in a child's life, of course, you're going to think about different types of interventions. So you might think more about family stability and early childhood education at much younger ages, or social capital, mentorship, college and career readiness are going to be things that are not going to make sense until kids are older. But what makes sense is that you have some support really pushing on this opportunity at every point along the way. Because every year that goes by where you're not pushing, that's a lost opportunity. So there's a lot of this going on in Providence. Very excited to hear the mayor and all that he is doing. and look forward to coming back to talk with you all later on this afternoon about how this all comes together. So thank you very much.